Many people have heard about how the White House was burned down during the War of 1812. However, most people probably don't know about the actual details of this story and just how crazy it was. It involves invading Canada, tornadoes, gunpowder paste on furniture, uneaten bacon dinners, flying cannons, and a woman with maybe her cow. And so before we get into this story that sounds closer to fiction than something that actually happened, this is episode 3 of my dedicated history videos, and so please feel free to check out any other videos you have missed, as I have a playlist created for your convenience. If you're new to the channel, I post everything from gaming to story times to educational content, and while that may sound confusing, I put effort into all of my videos that I post, so feel free to browse around for any other videos that might interest you. And with that being said, we can't talk about the burning of the White House and Washington DC without first talking about why and how the War of 1812 started. Growing up in America, I, and I also assume many others, was taught that the War of 1812 started because the British kept on kidnapping Americans and forcing them into the Royal Navy in what is called impressment. This was done because the British needed manpower, as it was a little preoccupied in fighting a guy called Napoleon Bonaparte. Furthermore, the British not only restricted trade with their enemy nations during the Napoleonic Wars, including restricting trade with America, but would also forcibly search American ships for deserters, meaning that if a British sailor, say, didn't want to deal with the harsh conditions of serving in the wartime Royal Navy and decided to desert and enlist in the American Navy, they were subject to being tried and even hanged if the British caught them, even if they were technically now a part of another navy. An example of this would be the Chesapeake Leopard affair of 1807, in which a British ship in search for deserters of the Royal Navy that now had become crewmen on the USS Chesapeake led to a one-sided skirmish after the Chesapeake refused to let the British search and seize these Royal Navy deserters, and the British would respond with cannon fire and the boarding of the ship that saw 3 killed, 18 wounded, and 4 crewmen of the USS Chesapeake being captured, with one of them by the name of Jenkin Radford being hanged as he was still a British citizen. This sparked enormous controversy as the British essentially big broed America and acted as judge, jury, and executioner of now sailors of the United States Navy. And of course, you can always argue that deserters are deserters regardless of which military they swear allegiance to afterwards, as they already violated their initial contract. That is a conversation for another time, as I don't want to get too sidetracked. Now, it is true that these acts of impressment and other acts that quote-unquote violated American honor did most definitely sour the relationship between the British and the Americans. But to stop there and say that this alone, alongside trade restrictions, was the cause for the start of the War of 1812 would be misleading. Never mind how the British actually lifted trade restrictions for the Americans prior to the start of the war. What is further and often left out of this narrative regarding the causes for the War of 1812 are the indigenous of America and Canada, which was a part of the British Empire at the time and divided into 2 provinces called Upper and Lower Canada. You see, before the American War of Independence, the Appalachian Mountains, according to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, was more or less the dividing point between the colonists and the various indigenous tribes of America. When the American War of Independence ended, many colonists began to disregard any previous agreements with the natives and instead began to push westwards, displacing many indigenous people. There was, of course, resistance by the natives, notably Tecumseh's Confederacy, who saw their already diminishing lands being further intruded upon by the Americans, and aided with weaponry and other supplies provided by the British. This was a thorn in the side of many Americans who wanted to expand westwards, but was subsequently faced heavy armed resistance by the indigenous tribes. I should note that the British wanting to supply the natives was not due to some sort of humanitarian appeal to morality or something like that, but out of pragmatism for their own interests in the Americas. And to expand on that, native resistance meant that not only could the expansionist ambitions of America be hindered, but it would also be useful to have various native tribes siding with the British in order to secure their Canadian provinces. But, I hear some of you probably asking, secure the Canadian provinces from whom? Well, the United States. You see, the hawkish elements of American society see Canada as a quote-unquote natural expansion of America in the past and in the present. You don't have to take my word for it, because Canada was invaded by America during the American War of Independence and was also invaded by the Americans during the War of 1812 3 times. Yes, Americans were being impressed into the Royal Navy. Yes, the Americans did not like the trade restrictions imposed by the British due to the Napoleonic Wars, and yes, all of this was the cause cause of much resentment towards the British, but there was also the additional factors of the British aiding native resistance to American expansion, and at least the hawkish elements of American society seeing Canada as an anchor for British influence in North America that needed to be quenched, alongside Canada being perceived as a, again, quote-unquote, natural part of the United States territory. And sure, declaring war on the British Empire one-on-one in this era would have been near suicide, but remember, the British was a little preoccupied with fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and so many in America thought that if war were to be declared on the British, and I quote, the acquisition of Canada this year, referring to the year of 1812, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us experience for the attack of Halifax, the next and the final expulsion of England from the American continent. And I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson, yes, the Thomas Jefferson, to William Dwan, who was an editor of the Philadelphia newspaper, on the 4th of August, 1812. In other words, the desire to acquire Canada isn't just me making shit up, I am quite literally quoting the Thomas Jefferson. And so what is my point in all this? Well, now that you hopefully understand that the War of 1812 wasn't just about impressment or trade restrictions, although it would be the stated casus belli, and I should again note that the trade restrictions were lifted before the war even started, the following story as a prelude to the burning of Washington is going to make a lot more sense. After 4 days of deliberation, war was declared on the British on June 18th of 1812. During the duration of the war, America would invade Canada 3 times, and it wouldn't be until a month after the initial declaration of war that the first of these invasions began. On July 12th of 1812, as one prong of a planned 4-pronged invasion, William Hull and his forces crossed the Detroit River and arrived in a place called Sandwich, now called Windsor, where he proceeded to threaten to destroy anyone who resisted, alongside killing any British officers that fought with the natives, and I quote, if the barbarous and savage policy of Great Britain be pursued, and the savages, referring to the indigenous peoples, are let loose to murder our citizens and butcher our women and children, the war will be a war of extermination. No white man found fighting by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Hull must have gone to the Roman school of diplomacy because, as you can imagine, this proclamation didn't do much but angered the Canadians and their allies even more. I probably should have said this earlier, but someone is probably saying, you're making America look bad by telling these stories. To that I have to say, first of all, this is just history. I don't know how else to elaborate on that. Second of all, I promise you, on my brother's life, that no Canadians are bribing me with maple syrup, nor are the British gonna airdrop me a lifetime supplies of pies and mash for making this video. And third of all, this is a story that results in the burning of the White House. It kind of implies that things were going a little bit wrong before that happened. So anyways, please understand that this is just history. Back to the story. On the 5th of August 1812, less than a month into Hull's invasion of Canada, 200 Ohio militiamen on a logistics run would lose against 25 Native Americans led by Chief Tecumseh, who after ambushing the militia resulted in 18 killed, 12 wounded, and 70 missing, as many of the militiamen would break ranks after losing morale and flee into the surrounding area. This defeat spurred Hull to abandon his position and retreat to the American controlled side of the Detroit River. Sheltering in Fort Detroit, they were soon besieged by the British, and seeing how low on gunpowder and cannonballs they were, Hull would surrender the fort on August 16th of the same year. 2 months later, in October, the fight for Canada resumed when another prong of this initial invasion, led by Major General Rensselaer, delayed due to a shortage of supplies and men, crossed the Niagara River in order to secure the strategic Queenston Heights, the Queenston Heights being needed as they overlooked the Niagara River. It should be noted that Major General Rensselaer had little actual military experience and was a political appointee. In fact, up to this point of the invasion, he had 0 experience in commanding any troops in battle, which is quite impressive that he made it to the rank of Major General, by the way. And so, on the early morning of October 13th, the American force would cross the Niagara River to begin the Battle of Queenston Heights. And already this invasion force was met with complications, as the river currents forced 3 boats of 13 total to turn back, meaning that only 10 boats of this advance party made it to shore, with those that did land being spotted by the British with alarms being raised. Getting off their ships, the Americans would form up after climbing the heights, where they advanced and engaged with a counter-attacking British force that resulted in both sides taking casualties and backing off, with the Americans withdrawing back to the heights and the British withdrawing back to the nearby village. And while both sides took losses, the Americans had successfully repelled the first of the British forces. At this point, the British were not only alerted to this invasion force, but British artillery had begun opening fire at the Americans at the landing zone alongside the second wave of boats crossing the river. This bombardment was so intense that 3 American boats panicked and began to turn back, and the chaos would only be stopped when counter-battery fire silenced the British guns. During this battle, the British officer in command, Major General Isaac Brock, would be killed in action leading an assault on American forces at the heights, when an American soldier who had been hiding behind some brush revealed himself and fired directly at the very obviously dressed officer from a distance of 46 meters, which even for a smoothbore musket was well within the effective range. The musket ball hit the heart and pretty much killed Major General Brock instantly, and with the loss of such an important figure being devastating for the British, as Major General Brock was well loved by his men and the locals. As the battle resumed, the body of Major General Brock would be carried and hidden near the house of a woman named Laura Secord. Remember that name. Seeing the checked British advance, General Rensselaer gave the order for more militiamen to cross the river, only for the men to refuse to support the men now stuck alone at the heights, as they were afraid to cross, leaving their comrades, the advance party, to fight the British alone. Now, some historians would say that this inaction was due to a lack of supplies, or perhaps loyalty to the state rather than the federal government from the militiamen, or perceived futility of such an assault. However, I beg to disagree, as the British were not only outnumbered 3-1, but a beloved British general had just been killed. If anything, the Americans had the upper hand. I tend to agree with others who simply explain that this wavering as a very human element of the fact that the militiamen who refused to cross were just scared. This is not to insult the men who partook in the battle, but I believe if people are to examine military failures, they should be sober in their assessments and not engage in, I guess you can say, historical cope. A quote from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment Military Museum concerning this battle states, Major General von Rensselaer ordered the militia on the American side to reinforce their beleaguered comrades on the Queenston Heights, but the sounds of battle and the war cries of the Mohawk terrified the American militia, and they refused to cross the river. The Americans on the Queenston Heights had no choice but to surrender. Regrouping, the British launched a second assault on the American at the heights, this time seeing more success. In fact, one of the Americans defending against this assault began to panic and spiked their own cannons too early, only for a volley of musket fire to actually mortally wound the new British officer in charge, Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, when his horse was first struck with a musket ball that caused it to turn around, and then another musket ball hit Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald in the back, while the other British officer in charge, Captain Williams, was grazed in the head with a musket ball that caused him to be knocked unconscious. Once Williams regained consciousness, he would order his men to retreat to a nearby farm, where additional reinforcements from the nearby Fort George, roughly 7 miles or 11 kilometers north, led by General Roger Hale Sheaffe, would join him at 2 p.m. This time, General Sheaffe would carefully devise a plan to once again assault the heights, taking his men on a wide detour that shielded them from artillery fire. While conducting this maneuver, he had Mohawk warriors, light infantry, and Ranchi's Colored Company, which was made out of freedmen and black indentured servants, attack the Americans entrenched on the heights from the west, which, by the way, the Mohawk warriors absolutely terrified the Americans and contributed to what followed next. From the words of Canadian historian Zygmunt Misek, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, I quote, "The First Nation warriors sniping at the Americans' hilltop positions so successfully that the invaders could not set up defenses, and though Brock perished that battle," referring to the previously mentioned General Brock, "his side won partly because the American militia refused to save their kin, terrified of the native war cries and the sight of bodies being carted off the battlefield." General Roger Hale Sheaffe, at a critical moment of the battle during the final assault and aided by Mohawk warriors, volley fired the Americans following a steady advance that caused a retreat which eventually turned into a full-on rout, as many Americans on the heights, in a panic to escape the onslaught, tried climbing down the cliffs only to fall to their deaths. Others reached the riverbank in a panic only to see that there were no more boats to carry them across to the other side, and so the men in a frenzy tried to swim across. Some drowned while others received a barrage of fire from the British and their allies for the next hour. The white flag of truce had to be brought up 3 times, and only on the final attempt the flag of surrender was adhered to. Almost 8,000 Americans would be captured. Between 60 to 100 killed and 80 wounded would be evacuated, while 90 wounded would be captured, while the British and their Mohawk allies had 21 killed, 85 wounded, and 22 captured. The Battle of Queenston Heights would be the first major battle in the War of 1812. Now, believe it or not, this entire time the British had not yet formally declared war on the United States, as, to put it bluntly, this entire affair, the War of 1812 in general, was essentially a side quest for the British, as the main focus of Britain at the time was defeating Napoleon. It wouldn't be until January 9th of 1813 that the British would respond with the Declaration of the Prince Regent, which stated British justifications for defending its subjects against American aggression, as the invasion of the Canadian provinces was not something that could simply be ignored. It should be further noted that this was still technically not a formal declaration of war by the British, and the British would not formally declare war throughout all of the War of 1812. But regardless, the Declaration of the Prince Regent was more of a response than anything that the British had given up to that point. On April 27th of 1813, Americans renewed their invasion of Canada by assaulting the city of York, now called Toronto. Landing 4 miles west of York, or 6.4 kilometers, the Americans, aided by naval guns, repelled the regulars and their allies, who eventually abandoned Fort York once they accidentally set off a gunpowder magazine that killed 20 British regulars. The retreating British forces kept their colors flying in order to trick the Americans to think that they were still there, while some sporadic cannon fire covered the retreat of the British forces. The Americans at this time, still not knowing that the fort was actually abandoned, were in the midst of rounding up and questioning prisoners around 180 meters from the walls of the fort, when suddenly an enormous explosion ripped through the air. The British had set off 300 barrels of gunpowder alongside other munitions to explode, killing 33 Americans, including the commander of the American force, Brigadier General Pike. So large was this explosion that it launched debris nearly 500 meters in all directions and injured an additional 222 Americans. Enraged, this act would be seen by the American forces as treachery and would contribute to what would happen next, the burning of York. American forces would loot and set fire to major governmental buildings, including the Palace of Government, as York was the capital of the province. For 6 days, York was looted, and at one point, the Americans found what they proclaimed to be a scalp in one of the governmental buildings. Now, this was almost certainly a wig, and keep in mind that this is more of a rumor or tall tale. But the point of this was to show how, quote-unquote, barbaric the Canadians were, keeping scalps and stuff inside the government buildings. And as you can imagine, the residents of York weren't exactly too keen to celebrate the arrival of the Americans. But regardless, this was an American victory, and a victory that heavily disrupted British supplies. However, it also created the sentiments, as you can put it, that would result in the burning of Washington. Following this victory at York, the Americans would again see success in capturing Fort George with little resistance, and then the Americans would capture Fort Erie after the British abandoned it. This advance was stalled when the British counterattacked at the Battle of Stony Creek. At almost midnight on June 5th, British forces and their native allies silently approached the American camp near Stony Creek. Stealth was key, as the advancing British forces removed flints from their muskets to prevent accidental discharges, as was described by Lieutenant Colonel Harvey in a letter discussing this battle afterwards. The British, having obtained the password to the camp in order to approach the sentries with less suspicion, bayoneted to death the American sentries guarding the camp, and it was only when another sentry, who could be heard screaming after he had been shot by an arrow and was in the midst of being tomahawked to death, was the plot revealed. Making a huge error after hearing the American sentry scream as he was being killed, the British forces all started letting out war cries and cheers as a response to General Vincent and his staff of the British forces giving cheers. What this did was alert all the Americans in the camp of which direction the British were hiding, leading to an intense firefight as both sides began exchanging fire in the dead of night. The fighting was chaos, so chaotic that American generals Chandler and Winder were captured when they saw soldiers in commotion at a nearby artillery battery. Thinking that they were friendly forces goofing and gaffing, they approached this battery in commotion to scold the men. However, by the time they realized that they were approaching British forces, it was too late, as they were quickly captured under the threat of becoming a human kebab. At some point, American troops were firing on American troops, and while the British had taken heavy losses and were actually the ones outnumbered, the confusion caused many of the Americans to flee, thinking that all was lost. And by the time dawn approached, the smaller and battered British forces pulled into the surrounding forest, while they watched the surviving Americans return to the camp to retrieve whatever they could before falling back themselves to the 40-mile creek. Not knowing that the entire time time, the British and their allies were the actual ones outnumbered. The Americans would again fall back to Fort George after hearing about the extensive amount of enemies in the area, with many native tribes now siding with the British, alongside British warships that now had arrived in the nearby Lake Ontario. But wait, I hear you may be asking, sure, the Americans were beaten at Stony Creek and had to withdraw, but their forces were still intact, and plus, the Americans won at York, they captured Fort George, they captured Fort Erie, so what went wrong? Well, in order to understand what happened, we need to talk about Laura Secord and maybe her cow. Following the retreat to Fort George, the American forces were battered but not broken. The British had now established an outpost near the Decow House, or Decow, I don't know, I'm sorry about that, a location that was close enough to launch raids and other harassing maneuvers. The Americans, wanting to first deal with this threat before any additional offensive actions, decided to send a force there to ambush and eliminate the British forces. The Americans sent over 600 men to take on the British by surprise. On June 23rd, American troops began the journey, resting at night in Queenston, where some American officers were given billeting at Laura Secord's house, that same house I mentioned during the Battle of Queenston Heights. This was a practice that wasn't anything new at the time. However, Laura Secord was no fan of the Americans. In fact, her husband, James Secord, fought in that same Battle of Queenston Heights and was actually shot twice but survived. Anyways, the story goes that on the night while the American soldiers were eating dinner in her house, they start discussing the upcoming battle plans to ambush the British. Laura overhears this and decides to inform the British forces at the Decow House. However, that was about 20 plus miles away, or 32 kilometers. In one story, she takes a cow with her in order to provide her with an excuse to explain why she was wandering around in the middle of nowhere between forests and fields, the cow being a convenient excuse in case she was questioned, that she was simply retrieving her cow that got lost frolicking around or something like that. Now, that does kind of make sense on paper, although I'm not sure what kind of hiking partner a cow would make, but there was no record of this at the time, and the only mention of Laura Secord with a cow would be decades later in the book 1812, The War and Its Moral by William Coffin, which was published in 1864. I think if a woman showed up out of nowhere with a cow, this would have been somewhat mentioned somewhere sooner. Not to mention the fact that Laura took an indirect and more stealthy route through a bunch of vegetation and other out-of-the-way paths, so I don't think a cow would have been able to keep up. So for the sake of historical accuracy, I will unfortunately not be including a cow in this story. At dawn of June 22nd, Laura sets off for the British outpost at the Decow House. There was actually a much closer outpost just 12 miles away that she could have contacted, but since there may have been American guards on the road leading to it, Laura decided to take a, detour. Laura's first stop was St. David's, as you can see on the map, and she was actually briefly joined by her niece, Elizabeth Secord, before Elizabeth had to turn back at Shipman's Corner due to being too tired to continue. In this journey, Laura would find herself traveling through forests and swamps and probably engaged in hand-to-hand combat with mosquitoes. By the time it was evening, Laura encountered a creek, and after scouting out the area, she located a fallen tree to use as a makeshift bridge. Upon crossing this creek, Laura ran into a camp of Mohawk warriors, and after explaining to them her mission, the Mohawk warriors took her to see the British commander James Fitzgibbon, who readied a force of 400 indigenous warriors and 50 British regulars to intercept the incoming American forces. An additional note is that Fitzgibbon was actually warned about the movement of American troops by native scouts. However, Laura's information is what confirmed the American objective and timing. 2 days later, on June 24th, while marching near Beaver Dams, the American forces received word that they were being surrounded. However, the Americans decided to essentially ignore this information and proceed on their original plan. Soon the native warriors opened fire, and among those wounded from the initial skirmish was the guy in charge, Colonel Borsler. And seeing that defeat was almost certain, the colonel surrendered to Fitzgibbon under the flag of truce, prodded by additional comments that if the Americans would not surrender, then the British could do nothing to stop their native allies from being restrained. Please note, I'm not implying that indigenous peoples are like naturally bloodthirsty savages or something like that. I am just going off of what British officer Fitzgibbon said. And so at the end of this battle for Beaver Dams, 5 to 15 men on the British side would be killed with an additional 20 to 25 wounded, while on the American side there would be 25 killed with an additional 50 wounded, now prisoners of war, with 512 being captured in total. Demoralized and with local support wavering now more than ever, the American forces would abandon Fort George alongside the Upper Canada region in December of 1813. Before they left the region, the Americans infamously destroyed the entire town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, and as this was December, many civilians had nowhere to sleep and froze to death. This event further angered the local Canadians alongside their allies. Now, so far I have spent a lot of time talking about the invasions of Canada. While it may seem a little strange, I'm doing that for a reason, I promise. It would be disingenuous for me to talk about the burning of Washington without first setting the scene of the animosity that was brewing years before the event. In other words, when war was declared by America on the British, it caught the British by surprise, as again, the British had repealed the trade restrictions as one of the casus bellis that the Americans gave for wanting to declare war. And Britain more or less thought of this as something that could be resolved in due time without further bloodshed. But fast forward to 1814, with the burning of York, the raising of Niagara-on-the-Lake, and so forth, there was much more hostility in the air. This is just something to keep in mind. And so in April of 1814, Napoleon, now exiled in Elba, meant that the British could finally turn their attention to their Canadian provinces and deal with the United States. On August 19th of 1814, a British invasion force of 4,500 men landed in the Chesapeake area in the port town of Benedict in Maryland, just 50 miles from the capital. And while Washington was within the line of attack for the British, so were the cities of Baltimore and Annapolis, which meant that American troops were split between Washington and other cities. American emissaries in Europe had actually been warning for many months now that as Napoleon was now exiled, there would be most likely a renewed assault on the United States, but the Secretary of War at the time, John Armstrong, didn't listen to any of these warnings, leaving the defense of Washington woefully unprepared. By the time it was apparent that the British assault was indeed headed for Washington, D.C., the area where the soon-to-be battle would occur would only be a few miles away from the capital, with 6,500 Americans, mostly militiamen, with only around 500 of these being U.S. Marines, sailors, and artillerymen ready to intercept the British forces. The battlefield would take place near the Anacostia River on the opposite side of the town of Bladensburg, specifically at a narrow crossing with a wooden bridge only able to fit 3 men standing side by side. The American plan was to stop the British advance by using this bridge and river as a checkpoint, backed by forming 3 defensive lines. The first 2 lines had mainly poorly trained militiamen, while the third line consisted of around 500 veteran mix of sailors, marines, alongside more militiamen. These defensive lines were hastily organized and poorly built, entrenchments were not properly dug, nor were the defenders actually given orders on what to do in case of a retreat. In fact, President James Madison was actually on the battlefield but started giving movement orders without permission, alongside movement orders also being given by the aforementioned Secretary of War John Armstrong, creating an immense amount of confusion and more chaos in organization. As if that wasn't bad enough, the Americans would actually be facing British regulars that were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, including units armed with Congreve rockets. At noon on August 24th, after about 2 days of marching, the British would arrive to meet the American forces at Bladensburg. Initially, things didn't look too bad. The initial advance of British troops to cross the river was stopped by artillery and rifle fire. However, this was only a momentary relief for the defenders, as the British decision to initiate this assault was hasty and unsupported. A more organized, renewed assault would have the British secure a foothold on the other side of the bridge, while more British troops managed to ford the river above the bridge in a flanking maneuver. Seeing the danger, this group was counterattacked by American militiamen and engaged in the action when the British began firing Congreve rockets. These rockets were technology that the British acquired from the Kingdom of Masuru after witnessing just how effective they could be in battle, resulting in the British adapting and creating their own versions. With different sized rockets for different ranges, explosive potential, and different purposes, the general features and advantages of these weapons were that they were light and fast to deploy, alongside being terrifying for the enemy. These rockets, due to their poor accuracy, were usually fired en masse, and the rockets would literally whistle and shriek in the air, followed by an enormous smoke trail and explosion that would altogether terrify both horses and men. However, the stabilization feature of a long stick meant that the travel path of these rockets was often unpredictable and could go flying in strange directions, and could even go flying back at the user in rare cases. So while these rockets could of course kill, the real effect was psychological. Now, I've been calling this the Battle of Bladensburg, but another name you hear for this battle is the Bladensburg races. You see, as the Americans came under fire from these rockets, morale broke. The first two lines collapsed as the militiamen were not used to conventional warfare nor being under fire from rockets, and without a proper plan in the face of a hardened enemy from the Peninsula Wars, a mass rout ensued. While the artillery from the Marines and sailors under the command of Commodore Joshua Barney was still pounding the British forces and inflicting heavy casualties, the advancing British and routing American militiamen resulted in pure chaos. Civilians who were supposed to be providing ammunition for the artillery pieces, seeing the panic and obviously untrained themselves, joined the fleeing troops, while the actually trained Marines and sailors still firing their guns did not receive the orders to retreat, but due to the civilian ammunition carriers fleeing, they were left with little ammunition to defend themselves. These Marines and sailors, low on ammunition, and while everyone else was routing, grabbed cutlasses and pikes and charged the British lines. And while they did lose this engagement after being outflanked, this impressed the British so much that Commodore Barney, who was captured after being shot in the legs by a musket ball, was congratulated by the British for his bravery and released. And while this resistance from the Marines and sailors was notable, it was only a small pocket of men in the thousands that fought and fled in this battle. So disgraceful was the sight of this rout that a British lieutenant would write in the Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, I quote, "Never did men with weapons in their hands make better use of their legs." Scattered, broken, and demoralized, the capital of the United States was open for the British. 3 days before the arrival of the British in Washington, the mood in the capital was somber. Civilians had already begun to pack up and leave the city, while the precious archival materials of the Senate were still left unevacuated. To give an idea of just how chaotic this period was, the Secretary of State, Samuel Otis, had passed away a few months prior in April. However, nobody was actually appointed to replace him, so two clerks by the name of John McDonald and Lewis Mackin had to informally take on the responsibility of saving as many documents as they could. Mackin commandeered a wagon to use and carry away at least the most important documents he could find, while McDonald had actually abandoned this task to save documents in order to help his family escape. Mackin, aided by the original driver of the cart that he commandeered and a messenger, was later then joined by McDonald the following morning, and he actually managed to get these documents to safety by bringing them to the nearby Montgomery County, while the wagon he was using to transport these documents broke down twice in the process. And during these chaotic days prior to the British, other clerks, such as a man by the name of Stephen Pleasanton, were ordered by the then Secretary of State, James Monroe, to save more national documents, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Stephen and others cut up linen pieces to assemble makeshift book bags to carry away these documents, while the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, saw these men securing these documents and then scolded them for being alarmists. Regardless, and after a brief detour, Stephen would drive these documents 35 miles away to Leesburg, Virginia, where they would be safe from the advancing British. On the evening of August 24th at around 8 p.m., the first of the British, an advance guard consisting of mainly high-ranking officers, arrived at Capitol Hill flying a flag of truce. This advance party received a hail of rifle fire, which killed a British soldier, wounded another, and also killed the horse being ridden by Major General Robert Ross, who was the commander of the forces at Bladensburg, who would also lead the burning of Washington, aided closely by Rear Admiral George Cockburn. And yes, that was his actual name. While the riflemen had fled, the surrounding buildings were torched as a response to this initial skirmish. At this point, the capital had been more or less abandoned with no resistance following this initial barrage of rifle fire. The nearby shipyard had been set on fire, which included the destruction of 2 newly constructed warships, and this was to deny the British of supplies and taking these vessels as their own. But otherwise, the capital was left to the British to enter and traverse key structures freely. The regulars entering the House and Senate marveled at the beautiful carvings and decorations and described witnessing, and I quote, monarchical splendor, referencing how beautiful the interior was. And it was actually a dismay to the British forces tasked to burn these buildings. However, they were under orders to do so in retaliation for the burning of York. In key areas, such as in the chamber of the House of Representatives, furniture was stacked high and slathered with gunpowder paste taken from the innards of Congreve rockets. Torches set this mixture alight, and the combination of furniture and gunpowder paste burned so intensely that glass skylights melted. Stone stone pillars expanded under the heat and collapsed. In the Library of Congress, over 30,000 books, including rare and irreplaceable books, were set ablaze. To the credit of the British, as they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, they saw the panicked remaining residents of the now burning Washington and stopped to assure these residents that their private property would not be set ablaze in a similar fate. And while the British did most definitely make attempts to stop looting, vandalism, and burning of private property, these things still took place to varying degrees. Now approaching the White House, at the time called the President's House or the Executive Mansion, the British found a lavishly prepared dinner by First Lady Dolly Madison for 40 officers who obviously could not attend the banquet. Dolly Madison, by the way, stayed in the White House after the guards had already left in order to save the original portrait of George Washington, as the legend goes. Two enslaved peoples by the name of Paul Jennings and Thomas McGrath tried helping Dolly remove the picture of Washington out of the frame, which was screwed down. And running out of time, Dolly cut the picture out of the frame and they transported it to safety. At least that is one account. Another account, and personally the one I'm more inclined to believe, is stated in the memoir and primary source, A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison, by the enslaved 15-year-old Paul Jennings, who said that the actual people that saved and cut out the painting was John Sucet, a French-born master of ceremonies, alongside himself and Thomas McGrath. The British, having in the same day marched, fought a battle, and entered Washington, stopped to eat this previously mentioned banquet that Dolly had helped prepare in the White House. One of these soldiers found President Madison's hat and, holding it on the tip of his bayonet, exclaimed that if he was unable to take James Madison prisoner, whom he called the Little President, he would parade his hat in England. After further looting, although I should note that at this point looters from the city had already broken in and ransacked some of the rooms, more fires would be set in a similar manner to the torching of other government buildings. These buildings included, but were not limited to, the building of the Department of War and the US Treasury building. Although the Treasury had been evacuated of its valuables, the fire set could be observed glowing as far as 50 miles away, with billowing pillars of black smoke as the onlookers observed. Widespread looting would break out throughout the city. Local residents of Washington would return to further loot whatever wasn't already burned in the Washington Navy Yard, and would continue to loot whatever wasn't destroyed or ransacked after the British had left. In total, the razing of Washington lasted for 26 hours, and fearing the arrival of additional American reinforcements, they left the American capital on the evening of August 25th. While preparing to leave on August 25th, storm clouds rolled into Washington, followed by a tornado and torrential rain. A British soldier who witnessed these events described it as, and I quote, "the prodigious force of the wind. It is impossible for you to form any conception. Roofs of houses were torn off by it and whisked into the air like sheets of paper, while the rain which accompanied it resembled the rushing of a mighty cataract rather than the dropping of a shower. So strong were these winds that cannons and debris went flying through the air, killing and injuring a few British soldiers." Now, you often hear this event as the storm that saved Washington, but that is not entirely correct. While the fires were indeed put out, it was a goddamn tornado that ripped buildings apart and damaged structures that the British had no intention of destroying, which I would know about because my house was actually hit by a tornado before. In fact, the burning stone structures, then quickly doused by rain, caused cracks in the heated stone alongside the tornado itself, uprooting trees and other buildings. Furthermore, the British were able to use the confusion caused by the storm to board their ships and leave. And speaking of leaving, once the British had left, it would only be a few days later on September 1st that President Madison and a retinue of officers returned to the now razed capital. While this destruction would be denounced by most, if not all Americans, this perspective was not shared by the British, who saw the destruction as fair considering what was done to York. In the Canadian provinces, George Prevost, governor and commander of the Canadian forces and nicknamed the Defender of Canada, would proclaim as a just retribution the proud capital at Washington had experienced a similar fate, in reference to the burning of York. While there was discussion to find a new location for the capital, the war would come to terms with the Treaty of Ghent being signed on December 24th of 1814, when the Americans and British met in Belgium and agreed on the treaty. Although famously the Battle of New Orleans would still take place on January 8th of 1815 with a major American victory, as the forces at New Orleans had not yet received word about the peace treaty, it wouldn't be until February 16th of 1815 that the American Senate had actually ratified the treaty, officially ending the War of 1812. In regard to the Treaty of Ghent, concerning the conversation of who won or lost, the treaty essentially restored territories to their pre-war status quo. There was no mention of impressment, and keep in mind that the British had already lifted trade restrictions before the war even started. However, everyone watching this is free to debate who won or lost the War of 1812, but I want to instead spend this time to point out how screwed over the indigenous peoples were by this treaty. Remember the Native native tribes allied with the British, including Chief Tecumseh, who would be killed during the War of 1812? Well, one of their motivations was to have an Indian buffer state of their own by allying with the British. However, the British gave up on this idea and just let the former allies out to fend for themselves once the indigenous peoples were no longer of use to their interests. It should further be noted that the indigenous did a tremendous amount of work for the British using their superior knowledge of the land, navigating stealthily alongside skills with various weaponry. I dare say that the British, especially in the early years of the war when preoccupied with Napoleon, would have suffered significant defeats if it wasn't for their Mohawk and the other indigenous allies. And so at the conclusion of the war, the British withdrew from supplying Indian tribes with weaponry, and over the next few years, both on the American and Canadian side, native territories would diminish after unequal treaty after unequal treaty. Thank you for watching and making it to the end. Please like and sub, only if you want to of course, as this video took a lot of time to make, but I do hope you enjoyed it. Also feel free to suggest more history stories that you want me to talk about. I prefer lesser known stories, albeit the burning of Washington is something that is well known but rarely talked about in detail. Hope to see you in the next video.